Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the first Food for Thought for 2025. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet today, the Whadjuk Noongar people, and I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and I extend that to all Torres Strait Islanders and Aboriginal peoples joining us today. Before we move into today's presentation, I'd just like to share some exciting news about some of the developments that are happening at the RPH Research Foundation on this site. Our next major capital works project will focus on revitalising the courtyard which sits between the building on Murray Street and this research facility. So there's going to be some intense activity happening over the next couple of months to transform this space into a place for relaxation and collaboration. And so we're really excited to be finally getting to this point. As part of this upgrade, we're also going to be moving into this building. We'll be redesigning the entryway. We'll be installing new lifts as well. They're on order. And there's a long delay while we await their arrival, and they'll be installed later this year. So there's a lot of activity happening, and we do recognise that can be disruptive. So our mandate is to make sure that we keep you informed. There will be regular communications going out on planned activity, and then if required on a daily basis if there's going to be any significant disruptive works. So in order to ensure that you're up to date and informed of what's happening, we encourage you to register via our social media communications. There's a QR code at the back. Please feel free to register and ensure that you do receive regular updates on the activities that are happening. So I'm really excited that we're going to be creating a space that is really welcoming for visitors and patients and researchers and those who work in these two buildings, and to see the space really come alive again. Part of the upgrade is also going to include a little cafe at the entry, so we really are improving the amenity of the site. I'm really excited about what a change we're going to see this calendar year. So the other news to advise is that our 2025 Nursing and Allied Health Grant Program has now closed, and we were really pleased to receive a very good number of submissions in this round. And we do have another grant round that will be opening a bit later this year, and we'll keep you informed of that as we go. So it's now my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Lee Nedcoff. Dr. Nedcoff wears many hats in the field of cardiovascular research and epidemiology. She is co-director of the Cardiovascular Epidemiology Research Centre at UWA, head of the Cardiology Population Health Lab at Victor Chang Cardiac Research Institute, as part of the UWA hub, co-director of the Big Data flagship for the Australian Cardiovascular Alliance, and board member and Allied Health Council chair for the Cardiac Society of Australia and New Zealand. She holds a National Heart Foundation Future Leader Fellowship, investigating the monitoring and surveillance of cardiovascular disease in Australia, with a particular focus on optimising use of data sources to produce clinically and policy-relevant data on CVD burden. Her presentation today is titled Cardiovascular Disease Burden and Trends, a deep dive into population data in Western Australia and beyond. And following her presentation, Trevor has very kindly agreed to facilitate the Q&A session and close off the event for us. So please now join me in welcoming Dr. Lee Nedcoff.
Great, thank you very much, and thanks very much for the invitation to speak today. I reiterate the acknowledgement of country that's already been given, particularly in light of the fact that I'll just show some data on Aboriginal cardiovascular health in Western Australia that we've produced, and we acknowledge that that data is very much about numbers, but there's a lot of sort of spiritual and cultural and social issues sort of that sit behind those numbers. So I acknowledge that up front. Marcus kind of gave me that very broad topic to talk about today. So what I thought I would do is start with a bit of a very quick global burden picture of CVD, just so everyone knows where things are up to. A little bit of a, again, sort of big picture national perspective of cardiovascular disease, particularly in terms of mortality and some changes going on there, and then show you some Western Australian data, a lot of which we've produced around some of the different types of cardiovascular disease. I'm not covering every type of cardiovascular disease, and I'm not really delving into risk factors. I'm sure there's people here who know more about that than I do, but given the data we use, these are the type of data that we produce. And Marcus also asked me to just touch on a little bit on data sources, because that's a really big thing now in Australia. Lots and lots of changes in terms of the health data landscape and what we can do with that for research. I'll also just start by saying I am a cardiovascular epidemiologist, but I started life as a professional life as a physiotherapist here at Royal Perth many years ago. So I've changed, it's sort of slight career veering off since then. So as I said, starting with global burden of disease, people might already be aware of this. We have seen substantial reductions in cardiovascular mortality rates, particularly age standardised rates over the last 3 decades. Okay, the graphs are just illustrations from the UK and US. It does remain the leading cause of death worldwide. However, if we look at the numbers, so if you look at mortality, 12 million deaths from CVD in 1990 throughout the world, 18 million in 2019, so 3 decades later. So age standardised rates are going down, but the numbers are going up. Similarly for prevalence, so that's the number of people living with the condition. 270 million people living with CVD in 1990, 570 million in 2019, so 3 decades later. So again, numbers are going up. As an epidemiologist, I'm very much into methodology and using the right methodology to make sure we get the right data, and then looking at how we interpret that data. I'm restraining myself in this talk from going too deep into methodology, I'll reassure you, but it is a little favourite thing of mine. I will delve into it in a few spots in the talk. So if we look at this issue of age standardisation, we, as epidemiologists, we love age standardisation because it sorts out a lot of kind of issues in the data and changing things over time, particularly when we're looking at trends. But if we're seeing age standardised rates going down, that's the blue line in the far graph there, but crude numbers and rates going up, so they're the red lines. Why is that happening? That's because the population is ageing globally and the size of the population is getting bigger. So those two things together give us that kind of slight discrepancy between age standardised versus crude rates. Similarly for prevalence in the bottom there, the red lines are showing increasing crude prevalence, so not standardised. The reason that that's happening versus kind of a slight decline in age standardised prevalence, which is the blue line on the far side, is because we're actually, if people get CVD, they're actually surviving for longer and living with CVD for long periods. And that is outweighing any improvements we're having in CVD incidence, so the onset of CVD. So I just sort of wanted to point out those slight inconsistencies at the beginning. We're doing pretty well in terms of some measures, but in fact there are more people kind of living with CVD and dying from CVD actually. In Australia, CVD is the second leading cause of death in Australia. The reason I put it in red is because people are still writing your first sentence of your grant application, CVD is the leading cause of death in Australia. It's not, so don't write it in your applications. It's the second leading cause of death. This graph starts in the early 1900s in Australia, and CVD mortality rates are the orangey red line there. You can see we had that big peak in the middle of that century and sort of later on, and from about the 70s, 80s, we've seen a massive decline in age standardised mortality rates from cardiovascular disease. The difference with a country like Australia and what I showed you on the previous slide is actually we're seeing crude rates going down and the number of CVD deaths going down as well. So we're actually doing pretty well in that sphere, and it's really good to look at the Australian data and not just take that big picture global burden, because there's so much that kind of goes into global burden of disease estimates. So we have done really well. The yellow line is cancer mortality, so that's where CVD has dipped down below cancer mortality in Australia as a cause of death. When government and other agencies look at causes of death, they also drill down into what was the underlying cause of death, not just these big broad disease groupings. And So when we drill down, again, I've put this in red because people keep writing this wrongly and saying it in the media and in their grant applications, etc. The leading cause of death in women in Australia is dementia. It is not coronary heart disease. And that changeover happened about 4 or 5 years ago. So you can see here in men, coronary heart disease remains the leading cause. In women, it's dementia now, but in women, coronary heart disease is the second leading cause. So as I said, that shift happened a couple of years ago for women. In men, dementia is the second leading cause of death, and that has actually kind of rocketed up the relative rankings, if you like, in terms of cause of death there. As you know, you can see the numbers of deaths annually as well on the side there, but just remember these are kind of relative rankings. This is where I will just veer off a little bit into methodology just to try and understand that shift, because you know we are interested in dementia obviously as well, because there's such a big vascular component to some types of dementia, and so just trying to understand that. There we go. So we have seen small increases in dementia mortality rates. The rates are not high, but around sort of 37, 40 per 100,000 in men and women in Australia. But about what happens is about 50% of deaths attributed to dementia are coded as an unspecified type. So it's not written that they're Alzheimer's or vascular dementia or the different types of dementia. And that's what's shown in that graph there. The dark green kind of columns are where it's coded as an unspecified type, and it's sort of the older age groups, and you can see in the very oldest age group, 85 plus, 95 plus, you know, the vast majority are coded as unspecified. So the issue for this becomes that I think it was around 2015, but don't quote me on that, it was around that time that coding standards for cause of death changed, and if on a death certificate the doctor wrote stroke or cerebrovascular disease and an unspecified dementia, the coding standards now instruct the coders to code it as a dementia underlying cause of death. So that's a real shift in coding. Maybe not so much a shift in kind of the disease burden, underlying disease burden. There was also, I don't really know the details, but I know that in Australia there was also this change in coding where previously veterans and Defence Force members were not able to be coded as a vascular dementia cause of death for I'm not sure what reason, and that has now been allowed. And so that has potentially had a bit of an impact. So the ABS are actually undertaking quite a bit of work at the moment to try and unpack this. And I think it's really important for us as cardiovascular researchers to understand it, because it impacts how we kind of view what's going on in cardiovascular disease as well. If there's bound to be some impact of the ageing population and that sort of thing, but clearly there's some impact of coding issues as well. So I'll veer back off my methodology, having my methodology hat on, but you know, I thought it was important to point that out. I'm not going to touch too much on COVID in this talk, except to say that in Australia, there were some small indirect, what we call indirect effects of COVID, and I'm talking about population level data, not about kind of the interaction physiologically of COVID and cardiovascular disease and that sort of thing. And even though early on there was some concern that people weren't getting scripts because of lockdowns or just, you know, being worried about going to the GP, and that in totality there wasn't a huge change in the total number of scripts issued or dispensed for CBD drugs during that early COVID period. There was a small decline in CBD hospital admissions as a whole during early lockdown periods, and you can sort of, this is national data, CBD hospital admissions, and you can sort of see it towards the end, but then perhaps a slight uptick, maybe just a rebound after those early kind of lockdowns. There is some Australian data, I think from New South Wales team, showing possibly low rates of new onset of some cardiovascular conditions in people admitted with COVID. So yeah, as I said, that's not really my area of expertise, but certainly in terms of health service use and the epidemiology of it, it's probably had some small impacts in Australia. So I'm going to go a bit more deeply into WA data now. You know, what's happening in WA in terms of the different types of cardiovascular conditions. We do a lot of work in coronary artery disease and acute coronary syndromes. I sort of forgot to ask, I know some people here, is everyone cardiovascular, or is there a range of people who don't work in cardiovascular? Everyone is? Kind of? Yep. Good. Okay. These are hospitalisation rates in WA from the late 1980s, not published, but you can see at top ST elevation, myocardial infarction, quite high and really rapid decline, which indicates decreasing severity of coronary artery disease. The dotted line is around the introduction of troponin assays to diagnose myocardial infarction. And you can see that that reduction in STEMI well predates that. The rates were coming down because of decreasing prevalence of a lot of the major cardiovascular risk factors. So that's what's kind of helped to drive that down, perhaps a little bit of flattening out. What you see with NSTEMI is around the time of the introduction of troponin assays in Western Australia, a really rapid rise in hospitalisations for NSTEMI in WA. When I've showed this data to some people from other countries, they can't quite believe that there were that many NSTEMIs being admitted, but that's what it is. We've done some validation work around this, and it probably looks like that early after the introduction of troponin, the doctors were like undercalling the NSTEMIs, which was a common sort of phenomenon around the world. They weren't quite willing yet to call, what used to be perhaps an unstable angina patient a myocardial infarction. And so that line probably should be a little bit higher in the early 2000s, and so therefore the increase shouldn't be quite as steep as it's shown there. But what we have now with myocardial infarction or heart attacks is that around 2/3 of them are NSTEMIs relative to STEMI. My colleague Frank Sanfilippo, who many of you would know, did some modelling work early on and found that the introduction of troponin really was estimated to increase MI admission rates by about 20% in women and 40% in men. So it has had a major impact. And as epidemiologists, we find that really difficult to manage because we want a nice sort of continuous trend to really know what's going on with disease burden. But these kind of diagnostic artefacts do interrupt that, and we have to really make sure we understand those changes. We've done a lot of work around acute coronary syndrome trends, and in fact, so this paper from WA was one of the first papers published internationally on population trends in ACS incidence. We found in that early period overall reductions in ACS incidence in WA, so we're doing pretty well. But one of the startling findings was this sort of increase about 4% per year in that time period of MI incidence in women aged under 55, and in men there was no decline. It was sort of a flat trend. Trends can vary depending on where you start and finish a time period, obviously. So we've kind of done lots of different cuts to see what's happening. We did this with our colleagues at Oxford in England, comparing our West Australian and Australian data against English and Oxford data. We found about a 3 to 4% per year, again, reduction in ACS hospitalisation in WA, so in that kind of slightly later period, completely underpinned by reductions in unstable angina. So MI incidence was kind of pootling along at a plateau, but UA is going down. We saw similar trends in our national Australian data, which at that point was unlinked, so there's some sort of issues with that, and we saw similar trends in the English data. Our most recent data, I've just got my postdoc to run this right to the end of 2022, which is the most up-to-date data we've got. So this is WA hospitalisation rates for the different types of ACS. You can see the bottom line in men and women is that dark blue, that's STEMI. So it's really come down. It looks like it's just plateauing a bit, but as rates get lower and lower, to incrementally keep moving them down, it just gets that little bit more difficult. The red line is unstable angina, so continuing to really skyrocket down, which is good because it's a kind of shows that even though there's probably a crossover to NSTEMI, which is that light blue line, disease burden is continuing to decrease, and finally the NSTEMI rates, that light blue line, are starting to come down a bit. So that's quite encouraging. So that's, I think, quite good news in WA that we are actually seeing not just ACS coming down, but all the different components of it starting to come down as well. We've just done this work on looking at 5-year follow-up and 5-year outcomes in people with acute coronary syndrome. So this is again using WA data, about 74,000 cases of ACS between 2003 and 2019. And these Kaplan-Meier curves just show the data for the last sort of 5 years of that period. But you can see that over that, this is the MACE is the outcome, so that's major adverse cardiovascular events, which is a combination of non-fatal MI, non-fatal stroke and cardiovascular death. And you can see that NSTEMI, even though we think NSTEMI is the kind of less severe form of myocardial infarction, in terms of outcomes over that period, there's quite a bit worse, I guess, than STEMI and unstable angina in both men and women. What we find though is that the NSTEMI patients are older, so in this cohort they're about 5 years older than the STEMI patients, quite a bit higher levels of comorbidities, in particular diabetes, heart failure and AF compared to the STEMI patients. And what we found when we did some sort of adjusted modelling was that this is STEMI and NSTEMI hazard ratios in the forest plot with unstable angina as the reference, so not shown on the plot. You can see that compared to unstable angina, all the way through men, women, all these time periods, hazard ratios are still higher. But you can also see that the NSTEMI and STEMI hazard ratios are quite similar to each other, so there's actually not a lot of difference at this 5-year outcome, even though STEMI patients, when they present, are obviously much more acutely ill and probably have higher levels of immediate sort of case fatality or death when they first present with a STEMI. So it kind of is indicating that we do need to take NSTEMI patients and STEMI patients really seriously over this long term. You can see what we found were the strongest predictors of adverse outcomes in these patients. And I think the biggest issue is that it's not really improving over time, and that's something that we need to look at from a secondary prevention perspective. Just in terms of ACS incidence, I mentioned that we've been doing some work on cardiovascular health and have done for a long time, led by Judy Katz-Ellenbogen in our group. We've been looking at the impact on acute coronary syndrome incidence from the Closing the Gap policies. They were implemented in Australia sort of 2008, 2009, a whole suite of things, so it's hard to, there's no one particular thing that perhaps would have impacted on ACS incidence, but what we've tried to do is look at trends in ACS incidence for Aboriginal people in Western Australia over this period. There's actually just almost no trend data on Aboriginal cardiovascular kind of outcomes like this, because there's been so many issues with trying to get a really robust and sort of clear definition of Aboriginal identification that has changed over time, both for people being admitted to hospital and in our census, so in our population data, which forms the denominators of our rates. So over this period, we had about 4,000 Aboriginal people with ACS admitted to hospital, for their first ACS event, admitted to hospital in Western Australia, over 64,000 non-Aboriginal people. You can see there's quite a bit of difference in the age distribution. So Aboriginal people, 60% of them are under 55 compared to 20% in non-Aboriginal people. And there's a slightly higher proportion of Aboriginal people of women compared to men. What we did see was the subtype, so STEMI and STEMI UA are quite similar distribution across Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal people, which is good because it allows for a little bit better comparison, I think. But this age difference is why we always stratify our Aboriginal studies by age, because otherwise it's just not comparable if you kind of combine, all the age groups together. So these are the rates. Aboriginal rates are in blue, non-Aboriginal in orange. You can clearly see the gap is there. It's quite a bit higher. Because of the smaller numbers of cases for Aboriginal people, that's why we've got these sort of slightly unstable rates, even when we use rolling averages and that type of thing. We've got two different blue lines for Aboriginal people because the ABS puts out population estimates for different time series, and they've got some overlapping time series and they're not the same. So, which is kind of slightly worrying. So we've decided that we're going to present both kind of estimates so we can see what that difference is, because it does have an impact, particularly for men. But what we think is happening is that you can see the orange line sort of slightly going down, which is nice. We think that and our regression modelling has showed just small declines across all the groups for Aboriginal people in ACS incidence. Probably not much of a decline for younger women, Aboriginal women, that's the only thing. And just to show this as a rate ratio, because this is really what the gap is. So a rate ratio shows the difference between the Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal rates. You can see that even though it looks bigger as people get older, so with the older age groups, so men here and women on the far side, actually the relative difference is greatest in the youngest age groups, and they're up the top there. So in Aboriginal men, the 10 times higher rate of ACS compared to non-Aboriginal men of the same age. In women, that's 23 times higher in Aboriginal women, and that's partly reflected by the fact that non-Aboriginal women under 55 have very low rates of acute coronary syndrome. So that the only issue with this all is that the gap is not closing over time, is what we've found in our data, but we do see some improvements in ACS incidence in Aboriginal people. So it's kind of that thing of their rates are going down, non-Aboriginal people are going down, but the gap isn't quite closing as time goes on. So, but still, from our Aboriginal colleagues, there is still some, they're quite pleased with some of those results because it's the first time we're sort of seeing rates reducing for their people. I thought I'd put the heading of this up because it really describes what we did in this study. And this is, the reason I show this, it's New South Wales data. I didn't, at the time I was involved in this, I didn't have a WA data set that could do the job, but I wanted to show the advantages of a comparative study and comparing across jurisdictions and between countries, because sometimes if you're just doing your own data within your own jurisdiction, you think you might be doing okay, but if you compare it against another jurisdiction, you realise you're much higher or much lower, etc. So what we did was this sort of big picture population thing looking at MI. We know mortality rates have been going down. We saw that with CVD at the beginning of the presentation, and that's very much driven by coronary disease and MI mortality trends. What we're trying to find out is it the fact that MI event rates are going down, so MI is occurring, that's kind of driving that good trend in MI mortality, or is it the fact that if people have an MI, that 30-day case fatality is improving, and that means early survival? So that what we're trying to get at is it sort of primary prevention, which is causing MI mortality to go down, or is it the fact that when people get to hospital with an MI, they're having really good treatment and they're surviving that early, very acute period after a heart attack? So what we had data from New South Wales, Canada, New Zealand and England, and just to again highlight the issue and the importance of comparative analyses, New Zealand is the purple line. So when we showed this to our New Zealand colleagues, and they did the data, so we didn't do the data for them, they looked at the event rates for New Zealand and mortality rates and said, oh, that can't be right, because we can't be that much higher than everyone else. But we went through everything, and it is correct. And so, it's only when you kind of put all that data together that you see differences or not. You see New South Wales tracks pretty similarly, right in the middle of everything, I guess. Case fatality, so that early survival, worse in England, the green line throughout, but we kind of knew that was going to be the case because they, trying to be diplomatic, through the early 2000s weren't quite as advanced as some other Western countries in terms of the way that they really sort of pushed acute care and management of acute coronary syndromes, and MI in particular. But they knew that and they got onto it, and you can see that gap has sort of closed over time, that their rate of improvement has been a lot greater than the other countries. So great, everything's going down. MI mortality is going down more than everything else. What's driving that? Is it that this is improving more, or case fatality is improving more? And we really wanted to look at it in an age and sex specific way. So this is really bright and will wake everyone up. I'll just walk you through it. The numbers are proportions, they're percentages. And if you look at red, which means that there's a greater contribution, a greater driver of that. So if you look at case fatality on the far side, and you can see age group at the top and then the countries, and men are at the top, women at the bottom. You can see both men and women and younger adults, there tendency more towards the red and orange. So that means in those age and sex groupings, that the fact that they're getting to, if they have an MI, they get to hospital, they have very good care, and that's driving down their mortality. They're surviving really well. That's what's driving down their mortality rates. If you look at older people, it's greener on that side. So that means they're getting less impact, less effect of surviving an MI, but what they're actually getting, if you look over to the event rates, they're redder on that side, they're having less MIs. Their MI rates are getting lower over time, which seems a little bit counterintuitive. But when we looked at the data, in New South Wales, in women under 55, the MI event rates are just flat or slightly going up, whereas in the older age groups, they're all going down. So again, it's sort of that theme which you'll hear a couple more times, about sort of under 55-year-olds. And as someone who is barely in that age bracket anymore, I'm very, very interested in this, and I don't have a clear understanding yet of why that is. So hopefully that kind of makes a little bit of sense, but to put it in words, the implications of it are that the fact that we've had such good improvements, and this goes for WA as well, this pattern will be seen in WA, such good improvements in evidence-based acute management of heart attack patients, it's the main reason that we're getting declines in MI mortality, particularly for younger adults. But because of that converse thing of we're not preventing MIs occurring in younger adults, we do need better approaches to prevent the onset of premature MI or coronary artery disease, and particularly in women. The other thing I just want to highlight is that I've talked quite a bit about acute coronary syndromes, and cardiologists deal with acute coronary syndromes all the time. There's so much research on it. We've got such good ways of measuring population burden of it now, and necessarily so, like it's a really severe, important condition. But what we did, this is part of the work we did with the Oxford team, but what we sort of discovered was that actually acute coronary syndromes, which is the red and orange, only makes up, it makes up about half of all admissions to hospital for coronary heart disease. But that means the other half, blue, with some slight variations over time and between countries, half of coronary heart disease admissions are chronic presentations. And when we first saw this, we sort of thought, well, why are there so many people coming to hospital for these chronic presentations, and what does that mean? So, And on top of that, we now have kind of an emerging clinical focus on it, and new guidelines really kind of focusing on this patient group. So I'm trying to get some funding, but also looking at this in WA data to start with, and we're going to leverage it out to a national sort of picture and look at what's happening. These are hospitalisation rates for the two types of chronic presentations you get in hospital data for coronary disease. Stable angina going down nicely. Just ignore the double lines, but the top two lines are men, the bottom two lines are women. They're just slightly differing definitions that I'm playing around with. You can see stable angina going down quite a lot, but chronic ischemic heart disease, which we'd never kind of looked at, everything just gets lumped together, going up. I think that the decline right at the end is a COVID impact, actually. And the reason being, the majority of those admissions are elective. 60% of them are in private hospitals, and the most commonly, so about 70% of them, are for coronary angiography with or without a PCI at the time. And in fact, most of them don't have a PCI at the time. So they're really about management, and so it really bothers me that we lump them all together as kind of a proxy or a measure of disease burden, because I don't think that's what it shows. So I'm still working on that, but I thought that would sort of be of interest, and I think we need to think about that when we're using these type of data as to how we kind of interpret them. Now, this is work done by our former PhD student, Courtney Webber, who I didn't know was going to be in the audience, but actually is, and she gets mentioned a few times. She's working here at Royal Perth with Danny Fedovich. And Courtney did some great work on heart failure, again, harking back to this kind of issue about what's going on in younger adults. She showed that we're seeing increasing incidence rates of heart failure. Again, this is WA data in under 55-year-olds since about 2003. But in this older age group, actually, it's a very, very sort of flat trend. There've been similar patterns in studies from other countries, including the Scandinavian countries, and not so much because they're Scandinavian, but because they also have good linked data systems which allow them to actually drill down into this sort of level of detail. The New Zealanders did a really nice paper, similar sort of paper on this, and they found a similar trend in under 50-year-olds, increasing heart failure incidence rates. They're starting to see it in this sort of middle age group, but only from a more recent time period, but still seeing declining rates in sort of the 80-plus year olds. So Courtney and I did an editorial on this actually for Heart, and what we sort of talked about was that this seems to increasingly be occurring in those without a history of ischemic heart disease or MI, which is often a driver of heart failure. There is a hypothesis that the increasing prevalence of diabetes and obesity might be impacting. I haven't seen really good data which kind of, definitively, statistically kind of links those together, but certainly a nice hypothesis. What we did note was that there's a differing percentage of these young heart failure populations that have cardiomyopathy. So that New Zealand study, they had very low, and in some of the other studies, including ours, 25 to 35%. Whether that's a real finding or just we think part of it is just differing definition and inclusion criteria in these studies. So we need a bit of standardisation between studies for a start and a better understanding of what the cardiomyopathy kind of coding and its interaction with heart failure is showing us. So again, another kind of alert and issue. And again, some more data from Courtney. I'm glad you're here. Atrial fibrillation. Atrial fibrillation is really hard to get a very good and accurate estimate of the population burden of it. Prevalence is estimated about 2% nationally from a variety of sources. I think it's probably an underestimate. We often rely on hospitalisation rates as a proxy for burden, but again, I think that can be problematic because sometimes hospitalisation rates are a product of management, particularly with, and I think, Courtney, your work showed this with ablation for AF coming into the picture, and that's sort of really driven admissions to hospital for AF. So again, when we look at hospital data, we have to be really careful about how we interpret it. And it most commonly gets coded as a secondary diagnosis, so it's not the primary reason for admission to hospital. So about 2/3 of cases are a secondary diagnosis, not the primary reason. So this work down here from WA showed increasing hospitalisation rates for AF in the older age groups, so the black, red and sort of blue age groups, sort of a little bit flatter in the younger age groups. If you look at the national AF hospitalisation rates overall, so all the ages combined, it's sort of reasonably flat. That dip at the end is most definitely COVID. And it just, I guess, is an indication too of people not going to hospital for other conditions and therefore AF not being recorded rather than a reduction in AF burden. The other thing I just wanted to say about that, I think that what this work also showed was that a lot of these admissions to hospital for AF are people having repeat hospitalisations. They're not sort of an onset of AF, for the first time. And I'll just finish off with stroke incidence before I talk quickly about the linked data landscape. We've done a lot of work around this where myself and Judy Katzenellenbogen are part of a synergy grant team called Stop Stroke, headed by Shauna Gall at the University of Tasmania. And we've done a lot of work using WA linked data to really inform how we measure stroke in Australia. So the top graph is about stroke incidence, sort of males overall and then females. Very small decline, almost non-existent in stroke incidence over that 2005 to 2017 period in WA, which is not dissimilar to what we're seeing sort of globally in other similar countries. By age group, increasing rates in over 75-year-olds. I'm not sure if you can see it. That's this yellow line up here, really big gap between over 75-year-olds and the other age groups. So it really is very much occurring in the oldest age groups. But again, it doesn't show on the graph because of the scale, but just a small increase in stroke incidence in younger adults, men and women actually. What we also, as I, again with my methodology hat on, part of what we did was to try and inform how other states and nationally they should be monitoring stroke incidence. And so where the arrow's pointing is what we call a standard definition of stroke, and then we played around with different parameters, add in different codes, take away this, add that. I won't go into all the details of those, but suffice to say you can see the difference it can make because there's all those different lines of differing magnitude up, above and below. The biggest issue we find is that a lot of people only have a hospital data set to look at stroke incidence. If you don't include mortality data, it underestimates stroke incidence by at least 11%. It's worse in females and it's worse in older people. So, and that's because people obviously pass away out of hospital from a stroke and don't make it to hospital. So you need to include it to get a proper and robust estimate of stroke incidence. Similarly, WA data is really fantastic and ahead of all the other states because we have such a long time series of data available, and it allows us to look back in historical medical records and decide if it's someone's first stroke, which is what stroke incidence is. Again, sorry, probably hard to see. This is our standard definition using a 10-year kind of history of stroke. Lots of publications use no history of stroke, and that's what you end up is that top line, which overestimates incidence by 40% because you're really just kind of getting hospitalisations and transfers and all these other kind of things going on, and it's not really a measure of stroke incidence. We're the only state that can then even look further back, so we used a 20-year look back, which is the very bottom line, which again is even better for estimating stroke incidence. And just to highlight that it's really great that we can use WA data in this way. We've informed the first national report on stroke and ACS incidents, which was published in 2022 by the AHW through our collaboration with them. And the data from all these, basically these graphs, has gone towards modelling the economic impact of stroke in Australia via the Stroke Foundation, which was published last year. And just finishing off with stroke in Aboriginal people, this is a combination of WA, so if you, Aboriginal people are the higher columns, as you can imagine, and non-Aboriginal people are the lower columns. The second columns along are WA data, and the third columns along are the combination of South Australian and Northern Territory data, because that always gets lumped together because so many people go from Alice Springs down to Adelaide for treatment, so there's all this sort of cross-border stuff, so it's better to analyse it together. Again, similar to ACS, you can see a much higher stroke incidence in Aboriginal people than non-Aboriginal people, both across women, men, and when restricted to only fatal stroke, so as I mentioned, those sort of out-of-hospital deaths, although the rates are lower, that disparity is still there across women and men. And these three columns are the younger, in each graph are the younger age group under 55-year-olds. So again, you can see a reasonable sort of burden of stroke in that younger adult population for Aboriginal people. So I'm just going to briefly touch on linked data. I'm not sure how much kind of everybody knows. I assume people know a little bit, but just a reminder of how linked health data started in Australia. So it actually started here in WA. I don't know if everyone kind of is aware of that, but Michael Hobbs is a public health physician who Laurie would know well, who I was lucky enough to work with when I first started at the group at UWA. He brought back the idea for linked data from Oxford, where he was doing his DPhil in the early 1970s, because they had a really good Oxford record linkage system set up. And between Michael, Fiona Stanley, Darcy Holman and John Bass, they worked to set up the first linked health data system in Australia in WA. And it started in about the mid-1990s because they got, I think it was Lottery West funding to get it up and going, and it's been running ever since then. And that's what's given us the advantage, is in that our data is kind of linked all the way back to 1980. It says 1970s, but I prefer not to use that data because some of it's difficult to interpret, but it's linked for a long time, whereas the other states only started in the 2000s, and so their data is only linked from about the early 2000s onwards. So it makes a big difference when you want to do long-term trend studies, or you want to do incidents and you want to look back in the data and see if they've got a history of different conditions. We've had no national linked health data in Australia until about 5 years ago, and so we actually lagged behind many countries in this respect. And now there's an explosion. It's just like taken off, and I can't even keep up with what's going on. And I'm talking all the time to various people, and I think, oh my God, you're doing that and you're linking that, and there's so much stuff going on. So I don't have an overview of everything by any means. In WA, we had a real downturn a couple of years ago in linked data and being able to access it. They were restructuring the group and the centre and the strategy, and it just, while that happened, nothing else happened. Like, we had data applications in, there was no ability to access data, etc. The strategy is now in place. There's a link there if anyone's interested. It's quite comprehensive and quite forward-looking, because we'd fallen a bit behind the other states. We're now moving to a secure cloud-based server for a better, secure, more flexible environment to analyse data. And they're doing some great proof of concept projects, creating these sort of synthetic health data sets to set up things. So one of the things they're doing is with WA Primary Health Network, setting up this big heart failure project with people at Curtin. So, that's one of the great examples of using it. You might hear talk of People WA. I haven't used it, but it's a new linked data asset in WA, combining the linked kind of health data, like hospitals data and that, with other government and social data sets like police and justice and education and that. So lots of my colleagues would use it. I probably don't have a great need to go to it just at this point in time. There's a whole heap of data sets available in WA. These are key ones. Emergency hospital we always use, births, cause of death, death registrations. Health and Wellbeing Surveillance System gives you some risk factor data if you do want it, and you can go to the health department and get them to disaggregate the data apart from what they just publish to get better estimates if you need that. There's no cardiovascular data linked in. There's the trauma registry, but there's no other sort of cardiovascular registry, no ACS registry, nothing like that. So, we're probably a little bit behind in that, and it would be great to see something that was able to be linked in. Now, is everyone aware of this, or has anyone heard about this, the National Health Data Hub? Because every single meeting I'm on, this is all that anyone talks about at the moment. It used to be called NECI, so they've moved on from that, if you've heard that. It's the first national health link data system in Australia, bringing in data from all the jurisdictions. It's designed to inform policy service delivery, so very government focused, but researchers can access it. They've had a huge number of projects approved and undergoing or finished, which government, mainly AHW, but also some of the state governments are doing. There've been about 5 CVD-related projects out of this, and I've listed them there. Tom Briffer, who many of you would know, and I sit on the advisory group to the AHW on monitoring CVD, so we kind of see all these projects and publications and reports as they're coming through and make comment on them and that, but they are very much sort of government-driven reports. There is some now researcher access to the data, but nothing that's come out of it from researchers just yet. I've got 2 applications in for chronic coronary disease and CVD more broadly. So if anyone's kind of interested or got ideas or whatever, there might be some opportunities within those data platforms. There's also this thing that they're calling the Hub plus N linkage, where you can link in an external registry. So if you've got an ACS registry or something else, you can actually link it into the Hub. It's a bit of a arduous process, and I think they're under-resourced to do it, but it's still a good idea. This is what the Hub looks like. So it's for Australia, it's actually quite comprehensive, and it's the first time we've ever had linked hospitals data in particular. So one thing I'll point out, WA is not in the Hub. So in terms of hospitals data, so WA and Northern Territory. So we're kind of missing from that purple side there, and we're waiting for privacy legislation to be enacted, which allows the state to share patient identifiers with the Commonwealth to allow them to link it in. So that's the hold up. And I don't know when that's happening. It's been coming for a few years now, but still great asset. Not systematic inclusion of private hospital data. And I'm a little bit concerned that people are going to start using this, and for some conditions like that chronic coronary disease, AF maybe, that there might be some wrong interpretation of data. So we just kind of need to keep that in mind. But importantly, MBS PBS. So we for the first time, get a linkage of drug data into the hospital data, and you have an ability to kind of do a lot of research in that respect, which for cardiovascular disease is really important. I'll just skip through that. Yeah, so that's the end. My final thoughts and kind of wrap up, I guess, are, again, as a methodologist, consider the nuances of the CVD burden measures, age standardisation versus crude rates or numbers, age-specific issues, coding changes. How we interpret the data is really important. Most of these methods kind of have a place, but it's the interpretation and the use of it that's really vital. I do have concerns about the burden and trends in younger adults, and I'll keep calling them younger adults, under 55-year-olds. I think that's still young in cardiovascular terms. I think that's kind of indicating, and even just overall, that we do have a need for better targeted primary prevention, particularly in that younger age group. These new linked data assets will provide a really good opportunity, and I think for us, particularly once WA goes into the WA hospitals data goes into it, there'll be an ability to kind of look at stuff that we haven't been able to look at before in some depth. I think we're doing pretty well in WA in terms of cardiovascular disease, but obviously some of those rates still are high, and particularly in Aboriginal people, and there's still a little way to go. So I'll leave it there, and happy to take any questions.
Wow. Thanks, Lee, for a very interesting presentation. Before we open it up to the audience, are there any questions online?
Not just yet.
No? Okay. All right. Well, are there any from the audience? If not, I'll lead on while they're thinking. In one of your earlier slides, you showed cardiovascular disease trends are falling, and I think you showed the UK, maybe was it? Which is very encouraging, and I guess in part that's probably due to better healthcare, increasing messages from health authorities and so forth. But you haven't talked about cardiovascular risk factors that sort of undermine all of that. And one of the important ones that probably intimately associates with cardiovascular disease is obesity, and it's going the other way. So how long do you think it'll be before that curve starts to bounce?
Well, I think we're possibly already seeing it, because my feeling is we concentrate on mortality and fatal cases because it's what we call a hard endpoint in epidemiology. It's the easiest to measure because you have a death certificate and a coded death, which are, the accuracy of the coding is reasonable. But because those rates have come down, we also need to look at non-fatal cases, and that's where hospitalisation rates and incidence of hospitalised cases is really important. And I showed a couple of conditions where we think they're going up, and that heart failure example, the hypothesis that it is impacting in heart failure, I suspect it's impacting in acute coronary syndrome and potentially interacting with diabetes. I just haven't seen any really sort of hard data linking the two. Do you know what I mean? Like, it's quite hard to kind of model that, or if you do model it, it's kind of, there's a lot of assumptions and it's not direct patient data. I think just intuitively you think it must be having an impact. That would be I'm interested to hear what other people think, but that would be my feeling. But combined with diabetes, yeah.
With, what is it, 2/3 of Australians being overweight, obese, and I think it was on the news earlier this week, and it's nothing new to this audience, likely to increase further, particularly in young children, adolescents and so forth.
Yeah, and then we get longer duration of people with those risk factors, and yeah. So I guess that's what I'm, we published first 10 years ago that increasing MI incidence in women under 55 in WA. And it was a little bit of it got published and it's been cited a lot, but it was a bit like, in fact, I have to tell you, one of the responses was, it must be Aboriginal women, as if like that kind of explains it, so don't worry about it. But since then, even if it is Aboriginal women, it's a concern. But since then, we're replicating it in different data sets in different countries. And if you're seeing those similar kind of risk factor trends in those countries, which we know they are, you have to sort of intuitively think there is some connection. Yeah.
Still no questions from Laurie. I knew Laurie would have a question.
Thanks very much, Lee. That's a wonderful oversight and insight combined. Getting the death certification diagnosis of dementia, there must be a lot of noise in the system. Even differentiating vascular dementia from non-vascular is a problem because the two often overlap, and the older people get, the more likely they are, and pathologically they're shown to overlap. So that's one area. But when a patient who has dementia ultimately dies, there are a range of possible immediate causes, like a heart attack or a stroke or an infection or whatever. So the diagnosis there even must be difficult in saying, whether the predominant cause was the frailty, if you like, associated with dementia, or whether it was, the underlying coronary disease that had been there. And compounding the problem is, of course, dementia is going to be diagnosed earlier and earlier. We know the process starts at least 20 years before somebody ends up in hospital or with a diagnosis of advanced dementia. So it's a complicated area.
Absolutely, and that's why I only gave one slide on the methodological issues. And exactly what you said about that crossover or the combination of vascular and non-vascular dementia, that's why they all get coded as unspecified, or it's just not, the type is difficult to tell, so it gets coded as unspecified. So I don't really understand the coding standard and why it was brought in, because it does create noise, and that's why we have to be really careful when we interpret the data. And so we do things like, what I showed you was underlying cause of death, and you then need to look at associated causes of death, multiple coded causes of death, and then kind of, do sensitivity analyses, make sure you include that, because highly likely they'll have their coronary disease or cerebrovascular disease coded as an additional cause. So you kind of need to bring all that into the picture. Age-specific analyses are really important, because then if there is a lot of noise, particularly in older people, that age group, there's noise, okay, and that's how we're going to interpret that. But as kind of you know, you go down to younger age groups. I agree that the age will shift down, but still there's less noise, and so you can kind of interpret things in that way. So that's one of my big things, is sort of how do we interpret the data and setting up the analyses so that you can interpret it in a way that's kind of reasonable. Yeah, yeah. I think it's going to be interesting, I think, to watch. Yeah.
You've shown how, so just carrying on, how the onset of use of troponin has altered the diagnostic rates of coronary disease.
Yeah.
Well, with blood tests coming for
Yep.
diagnosis of dementia,
Yeah, yeah.
to distant future, you're going to have some.
Troponin nearly set Michael Hobbs over the edge because it interrupted, as an epidemiologist, his ability to consistently monitor a condition over time, and it took him a long time to get his head around troponin and accept that it was here to stay. And the fact that the sensitivity of troponin assays have then continued to change, increase over time, has an even, an ongoing effect. It wasn't like a point in time, it just continually kind of changes the baseline. So yeah, it's interesting.
Hi, my background is as a GP, and I'm interested to know if you are on an ongoing basis correlating these rates with other kind of comorbidities that you wouldn't necessarily traditionally associate with cardiovascular disease. I ask this in part because with the proposal that my GP colleagues would be able to prescribe more stimulants for ADHD, some of my colleagues, and I don't necessarily share their concerns, but some of my colleagues are concerned about the whether or not longer term stimulant use and the increasing use of stimulants for ADHD in adults is increasing cardiovascular risk, and it just strikes me not just relevant to ADHD, but whether there are
other conditions
or other managements that are coming, particularly when you talk about that younger age group. Is there ongoing monitoring to see if there's something else coming to bear that we wouldn't have normally had on the radar?
I guess that we think about that, and probably sometimes what we're limited by is the data availability. So one of the issues with the way we have traditionally got data from WA Health with our WA linked data sets is they essentially extract what we tell them to ask them to extract. They send us the data set, it sits on our server at the university. That gives us no flexibility to then say, oh, by the way, we now notice, we're hearing about this. Can we investigate exactly what you're talking about? Because we haven't asked for that data. The new cloud-based servers, and the hub is sitting on one of these servers, are better because they don't extract data for you. The data is all there. I'm not very highly technical, so I just, it's kind of all there. And you say to them, this is the study I want to do. And then you go into the hub and go, right, well, I'll need this data, and this data. And by the way, we're thinking that, ADHD kind of prescribing rates are going up and da-da-da. So you can then kind of broaden you have more flexibility in what you can then investigate. So I think that side of the data picture will actually help us as researchers, actually, and allow us to adapt more quickly and be more flexible rather than this sort of standalone, like the data set we've got for WA is huge. Because it goes back sort of 30 years. We've got all CVD, all diabetes, all chronic kidney disease, but we can't justify kind of going, oh, by the way, we also want all neurological conditions and all, and it doesn't include medications, but all other, sort of conditions that might be associated. They just don't sort of take that on board, and then it ends up being even more enormous. So I think that will help, and it will help us to kind of look at those sort of things. We do have those in mind. I know Courtney's doing work around drugs of dependency. Yes, yeah, and because that's been one of our thoughts as well around ACS in younger adults. Is there some sort of connection there? And I think this hub will help us kind of with that as well, because we'll have better access to sort of a wider range of data. Yeah, exactly.
Are there any questions from online? None? Just one, if there aren't any more. One final one from me. I mean, all governments, past and present, like to talk about closing the gap and throwing millions, hundreds of millions at throwing the gap. And nothing has really happened, as you showed. The easy question, what's the answer?
Yeah. So we present our data. We work with our Aboriginal colleagues, and we presented it quite recently to them. We go through it in a lot of detail. They still think that because we're talking about incidence, and what drives incidence is what's going on in the primary prevention space. Sure, they might not get the best treatment when they get to hospital, or as good a treatment as they should, or they're in a rural area so they can't get down for a PCI easily, or that sort of thing. So there's access issues. But what's driving the ACS in the first time is that primary prevention space. It's risk factors. If they've got risk factors, are they getting good management? So our Aboriginal colleagues still think there's a lot of access issues. They think there's a lot of systemic racism issues, which stops people kind of, getting the access or seeking access or being proactive in their care. And there's a big thing also for Aboriginal people around the messaging. And so our team has done a lot in the rheumatic heart disease space in terms of coming up, working with Aboriginal communities. One of our PhD students did her PhD sitting in one of the Yolngu community in the Northern Territory, where they worked with the community to come, and with some leaders in that community, to come up with messaging about how to prevent acute rheumatic fever and therefore prevent rheumatic heart disease. So it's kind of on their terms, in their context, in their cultural context, so they get it. And they think that some of that is perhaps needed around the cardiovascular risk factor space. I'm sure there's a bit of work that's already been done, but there's more that can be done.
We really need more Indigenous health professionals, GPs and so forth, a bit like I think Alex Brown in South Australia.
Yeah. But Alex kind of is, I don't know if people know, people probably do know Alex, but he's completely overwhelmed with kind of taking on the problems of the world. So we work a bit with Alex and trying to, the capacity building for, as you say, Aboriginal sort of health workers, those sorts of professions, trying to bring people like that into the cardiac society so that they have a space as well. There's an Indigenous cardiac society conference in June in Sydney, so that's always a great opportunity for people in that space to kind of get together and really try and work on some of these problems. Yeah.
Okay, well look, I'm mindful of time, so please join me in thanking Lee for a very stimulating presentation. Before you leave, there is some food, I'm sure, still left at the back, so